Thank you. I'm Mark Cohen from Oxfam America, and in a previous life when Francis was on the board of IFPRI, I was the secretary to the board, so I never asked any questions, I just took the notes. But two questions for you now. One, on the Malaysia case, you didn't mention it, but I have the impression, and I'm sitting next to my Malaysia expert here, so he can chime in, Blake. But my impression is you have a reduction in horizontal inequality at the expense of greater vertical inequality, that is, within the Malay or Bumiputra community, there's actually a greater deal of inequality because there were those who benefited from the policies who were relatively small in number within the large group of Malays. Second question, you touched on natural resource issues and you talked about green wars at the very beginning. The new fad in conflict studies, I think, is to explain how conflicts are really all being driven by climate change. And so could you comment on that?
Thank you. I'm Werner Kiene. Used to be with World Bank's inspection panel. I didn't hear the word win-win in this. It came in a negative sense when you talked about the international conflicts. I think all of us realize if we don't do something with these particular groups, we might not have an easy life. But somehow in the policy use, it would be quite useful for those who have to change if the policy research would also show the win side to those who have presumably something to give up. I mean, that's something more from a practical perspective. The other thing I remember when I worked in West Africa and tried to get into some of these things in the French countries, nous sommes tous pauvres. We're all the same. So this differentiation which you need for this is politically sensitive. And I think we from the outside have, like, we didn't talk about corruption and all these, we didn't talk about these things. So I appreciate very much that, as you said, make it transparent. This is a wonderful addition to our instruments. But where are the leaders on this? And what is needed to help this transparency making without being incendiary, I mean, creating more fire?
Jim Chase with the Coalition for Economic Empowerment. And you presented it as if there was a benign international community. And I really see the G8 bearing a lot of responsibility for the current situation. I'm thinking of Africa, where they went from a kind of an amorphous federalism of sorts to a nation state overnight, and a nation state's built on warfare. The European model of power politics. So it seems like there's this basic structure was set in place by G8 type people, and I'm most familiar with Afghanistan, where I just returned, and Afghanistan is fueled by the G8. It has been, if you include Saudi Arabia, the money coming from Saudi Arabia that funds it, there's just an amazing influence from the outside. But the main reason I'm asking the question is the covert war notion, because clearly part of Africa's problem is all the arms that came in from the Soviet side and the U.S. side during the Cold War and remain there. And there's still the CIA supports contraband movement when it supports their people. And there's just a lot of fuel added to the fire from the outside, it appears, and I'm wondering what can be done about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just say thank you very much for your comments and also your examples, which were so great. I just wanted to make one point about Ghana, which is that it's, the problem is that there's a whole lot of development going on at the same time, which is basically privileging the South. And this is all to do with the structural adjustment and so on. So unless we tackle that as well as the Northern Fund, I think you were saying that, but it is very apparent in Ghana that you have to. And I think that's why we look at the persistence of poverty. It's no good just tackling it in just at one point, like education, and not doing all the complementary things. I think you said it, but I was just bringing that out. On the questions, yes, Mark. Malaysia, it's interesting. In the actual 1970 to 80, which was the peak of the policies, the intra-group inequalities actually improved. And the reason was it depends so much on the design of the policies. And the policies were designed in two ways, partly to hit the top people by giving them more access to contracts and things, but very largely to hit the bottom people by giving them access to different sorts of jobs and better education. So you can imagine that you could devise a policy which would improve horizontal inequality entirely directed at the bottom or entirely at the top. Now in South Africa, they really have had more unequalizing policies because they've been primarily directed at the capital end, at the top end, and they haven't done nearly enough for the bottom end. So you're perfectly right, it can happen, but it doesn't have to happen. But even if it happens, from my perspective, which is one of worrying about conflict, I'm not sure it's an unhealthy development, because then you do get a new elite coming out in the underprivileged group who've got a lot of stake in that society and don't want to have a conflict. So it's a problem, but not necessary. Yeah, climate change. Well, I would talk a little bit about water, which is part of the climate change issue. There obviously is going to be a lot of pressure on people. There's going to be more migration, so there's going to be more multi-ethnicity. Resources are going to increase in value, so if you've got access to resources, the inequalities will widen, some will not. So I don't think it's good news. It's likely to increase all these problems. The win-win situation is a very important thing, because the question is not just the recalcitrant G8 and so on, but how do you persuade governments that they need to take this action if you can't persuade them that it's a sort of win-win? Well, one side of the win is clearly that you're going to have a peaceful society, and that's what Nkrumah recognised. You know, these great leaders recognise it, and that's why in Ghana I think things have been, there's a national identity, and there's a sense that they should be inclusive. And you would say, really, the Nigerian, in a much more sort of cumbersome way, has recognised the same thing, that they have to do something if they want to have peace. And all these policies that I record from around the world that's their main incentive. They think that that's the only way they're going to keep together. But there are other wins, which is, I think, it's a more efficient strategy. Most of the evidence on, say, affirmative action in the US shows, if anything, it improves efficiency. Because what you're doing is you're getting at a potential which wasn't previously used. So a whole big group who had got talent but were not being educated are suddenly being brought into that society. So I think you can argue for wins, but they're not very discrete wins. So I'm not sure probably the Protestants in Northern Ireland would benefit from the peace, but they wouldn't see themselves as benefiting particularly from the efficiency. So it's a little bit difficult, this thing, to sell, but I think the peace is the chief thing. And that we didn't talk about these issues. When I was first doing research, and I worked in Kenya, and you weren't even allowed to mention ethnicity or tribe. It was like this was an unmentionable thing. And Colin Lees came along and wrote a whole book about how it was all about the comprador and socialism and class in Kenya, which was clearly completely off the wall, really. But you weren't allowed to mention these things. And now I think they are talked about more in Africa and in Asia and everywhere by Africans and by Asians, and not just by outsiders. So I think all we can do is just bring them into the discourse and encourage and support data collection and do it for ourselves. Certainly in the UK we have wonderful data on ethnicity now. You can't do anything. You can't go to the doctors without saying what ethnicity you are. And if you're not sure, it sort of takes a lot of time because you spend about 10 minutes trying to decide what ethnicity you are. But it's all collected together, and they've just brought out a wonderful report on inequality in Britain, which just shows you how all the different groups are faring on access to resources and returns to resources, and which are doing better and which are doing worse. And there's no revolution is starting there, but is incorporated into policy. So I think it needs just to be part of our routinized analysis, and then it'll become much less provocative. It's all the responsibility of the G8, or it's largely. Yeah, I think the G8 is very responsible because it invented a lot of these distinctions in the first place. I mean, Malaysia were just Malays, and then they brought in the Indians in a certain position, and the Chinese, and then in certain countries like Rwanda, they gave them passports more or less if they were one ethnicity and not another, although previously there hadn't been a very clear distinction at all. So there's a lot of responsibility in the colonial period, and post-colonial, a lot of the aid goes in one way or another. And here, I think what we need to do, and really importantly, is to try and prove to the people who make decisions that this is not the way to create peace. And your covert fighting and this, that, and the other, it's the opposite of the way to make peace. And that what we need is to take this sort of development, fair, inclusive development, and that's the way that, if you really want a stable society, that's the way to go. And, of course, there's your win-win, because the G8 does want stable societies. They don't want breeding grounds of terrorism, as they put it. So, but, yeah, I think it's a very, very important issue.
Yeah, Xin Shendiao from IFPRI. My question is the relationship between vertical and horizontal inequality. And also my question is basically for the economic policy. And then I wonder whether there's a pattern, actually there's some sequential issue for horizontal and
I'm not sure I caught the last question.
Whether there's a pattern?
Yeah, whether there's certain patterns for the relationship between vertical and horizontal inequality.
Yeah.
For the country like Ethiopia, Regina mentioned, can we say actually at this moment, actually, vertical maybe is a priority? And after the poverty and the economic development at a certain level, and then the horizontal start to become more important. So that's why related to this sequential issue, whether there's certain trade-off. So given the limited resource for the government in terms of public investment and other kind of intervention, whether we ask too much for the government, for a poor government, you have to have inequality reduced, vertical, horizontal. In the meantime, you have to meet your millennium goal.
Thank you. Can you pass the mic down to Bob? And then we'll come back to Derek.
Thank you. Bob Bird, Alliance for Peace Building and other groups. Francis, thank you very much for another magnificent contribution in which you continue to kind of bring us something akin to color to sight. I'm wondering if you have thought of the implications for the field of public administration in teaching it of these findings, and whether you have any plans to kind of sketch out what you think the ideal training for leaders of these communities might be.
Derek?
Somewhat simple question. Is your hypothesis in danger? Is your hypothesis in danger of being a kind of truism or tautology? I mean, all conflicts are between groups. So is this distinction between vertical and horizontal somewhat artificial? I mean, you could argue that if everything's between groups, I mean, high-income people are one group and low-income people are another group, because when you came to your list, you had class as one group, which I think of as vertical inequality. And kind of extending that, you mentioned that people talk to you about counterfactuals. If you're playing the devil's advocate, what are the kind of counterfactuals to your hypothesis, if any? And then the third thing, kind of on that, what about failed states like Somalia? Are horizontal inequalities a big thing there?
Francis, do you want to stop there, or can I take more questions?
Whatever you like.
I think, let me just see a show of hands. I had Gershon and I had John. Was that the two? Why don't we take the two of you, because then we'll be able to wrap up more properly. Gershon?
Gershon Federer in IFPRI. I'm going to advance a quick theory which actually deals with groups that don't come to a conflict. And it's because they're small and weak, and the paradox is that these are the problems that would be the cheapest and easier to resolve because the groups are small, but it's because they don't have a leverage and they cannot engage in an armed conflict that there is no pressure. And I would say that it's the case of these groups where the international community can play a role, because they are the ones who can make noise about it and highlight the plight of the group.
And then John.
John Whitehead from IFPRI. This question has already been asked to an extent, but I am curious about the notion of class as a definer of horizontal inequality. What defines a class as a group if it's viewed distinct from ethnicity, religion, what have you?
And I also have a question, not for you, but I'm curious now from Regina, from the previous discussion on the G8 and now the new actors, G20 and the like. And at the same time, we are all kind of looking again at the global governance of food and agriculture. How does that look again at the global governance? How is that shaped, Should we be rethinking how we look at that? Thank you. Francis?
Right, very interesting questions. First of all, vertical and horizontal inequalities. We've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And sort of mathematically, a vertical inequality is normally defined in relation to the whole society. So it would encompass both between and within group inequalities. So just mathematically, for a given within group inequality, the bigger the between group inequality, the bigger the vertical inequality. But it's not a very large relationship because there's a lot of stuff going on within the groups. So you can look at the formula. So mathematically there should be some relationship. Empirically, it's interesting that they're orthogonal. When we look at where we've looked at it, for example, if you take Gudrun's work and you look at it, her globally, she finds no relationship between the countries she looks at, horizontal and vertical inequality. Similarly, in the Indonesian data, we find very low relationship. We find some, but a low relationship. So empirically, there's quite a small relationship between the two. So we're really getting at something a bit different. Then you said, what should the priorities be? Well, I would start by talking about justice. And I think that from a point of view of justice, you can argue that there may be some case for inequalities between, for some vertical inequalities, because people have different talents, work hard in different ways, and so on. So you can find some genuine reason why you might want to have vertical inequality. Very difficult to find any genuine reason why you should want horizontal inequality. So from the perspective of justice, I feel that horizontal inequality is unjust in a way that you can't say it quite so clearly about vertical inequality. So that doesn't tell you about priorities, it tells you sort of where I'm coming from and where my priorities are. When it comes to societies, I would say that, again, if you did have a priority, I think, well, it's difficult because I care a lot about poverty, and of course that's related to vertical inequality. But I would tend to say that horizontal inequalities in the early stages are very important. It's very important to tackle them because you will expect, as you get development, you will expect, certain people to move up, and you expect a certain amount of vertical inequality to arise. And you may expect a certain amount of horizontal inequality, but I think that you should tackle the horizontal. I would put quite a strong priority on horizontal inequality, subject to the fact that you do need anti-poverty programs, and very often they do improve horizontal as well as vertical inequality, but sometimes they don't, like in Regina's interesting case on Ghana. And we'd picked up the same thing actually in real Ghana before you get to the counterfactual in the future, that you can have a good reduction in national poverty and a worsening of the inequality. So you have to think about that. But anyway, everyone has their own priorities. And I think overriding government's priorities are going to be what's politically acceptable and so on. And if they think that there's really going to be a conflict, they'll probably put more priority on that than on the vertical inequality. On public administration and what people should be taught, well, I think that to start with, that this issue is hugely important and therefore should be a consideration in economic policy and the composition of the administration. I think that would be the priority, and then to go on to how you would deal with it. Now we come to the cynic. Is it a truism? Well, it would be a truism if you were going to be totally flexible about identities. But I'm not totally flexible. Any random group is going to count as an identity. It's thought, and that really brings me to the class thing. The reason I think of class as an identity is not because you can categorize people into different income groups, but because they may find it a certain identity. Like peasants' associations where they themselves organize around it. So if you find peasants' associations organizing around the identity of being a peasant, that's a way in which class, I would say, would enter into the potential for political mobilization and even sometimes conflict. And it's there where peasants were very discriminated against vis-a-vis landowners. You might find that that would be a same sort of conflict that I'm talking about. But if it's just randomly rich people and randomly poor people who don't belong to any particular identity group, well, then it wouldn't really, that wouldn't count for me as the same thing as I'm talking about. And indeed, as I said at the beginning, when you look at that econometrically, you don't find any particular relationship between vertical inequality and conflict. Whereas you do find, as far as I know, I haven't done the research myself on this, but you do find it between criminality and vertical inequality, which is maybe what you expect. Then you asked, what about the counterfactual? Yeah, well, Brazil would be. I mean, the first time I ever gave a talk on this, people said, what about Brazil? And that is true. I mean, Brazil is a very big counterfactual of a country with big regional inequality, big racial inequality, very violent society, and yet it's never taken to this sort of violence. And that's why I think the econometric work is important, because it shows you that, yes, there are exceptions, there always are, but the risk of conflict does seem to go up where you have more horizontal inequalities. On failed states, there are many reasons for failed states besides this. And I don't think that in Somalia, say, horizontal inequality is all that important as an issue. Yeah, the small groups point, I think, is absolutely, well, it's absolutely good up to a point. It's surprising how often the small groups do take to conflict. But, I mean, absolutely without any expectations of success. You know, like you've had northern Uganda, a continuous conflict for a long time, which is never going to, it's now at the moment stopped, but, you know, it was never going to succeed. On the other hand, it was never going to fail. It just went on and on and on. You've had similar sorts of things in northern Kenya that we don't really even hear about, coming up and down and so on. You have, I mean, it depends how small you're talking about, small, but small groups in Thailand, which are in conflict. So I'm not disagreeing with your point that the international community should worry about the small groups who are not in conflict as well as the small groups who are in conflict. But I think the small groups do quite often take to conflict, despite the fact that they're not really big enough to have any real chance of success. I think that I've probably said enough about class. The last question, I think, was on class.
Regina?
Yeah, maybe in view of the time, I would like to just to answer the last question, your question on the global governance. It was a bit unfortunate there wasn't really enough time for you to expand on this very interesting other question, to taking that to the international level and look at inequalities between countries and what consequences that actually has. And I think that is particularly important because, as the gentleman who now left pointed out, that is this international context that provides the fuel for many of these regional or even intra-state conflicts to last for so long. I mean, the Lord Resistance Army in northern Uganda could not have terrorized the population for over 20 years had they not been part of a larger international conflict, and that's where the weapons come from. So I think it's both because of its effect on the ground and because of the international implications. I think it's very important that the international community takes this issue of global inequality very serious. And I mean, what one can observe, I think that there are two major issues to be addressed here. One is to reach an agreement in the global community on how much we should actually do about global inequalities. So how proactive should the international community be? And there are certainly differences in the opinions between, say, the previous US government and European countries. I think with the current administration, there is a recognition to do more. And climate change is just one example. But climate change is also an example that even if you agree you should do more, you have to solve the collective action problem of actually doing that. So how much of global justice is the international community actually able to achieve? And the other side of that coin is the reform. I think that was also what your question referred to the reform of the global organization that we actually have in place to possibly address these issues. And I mean, it's still a sad fact that the institutions we have are mainly still functioning according to the principles when they were set up after the Second World War. I mean, who votes in the Security Council? That until today governs the major organizations. Luckily, we can observe that there are some major efforts to reform them going on. And I think it's important also for us to engage in this debate. Because what we can observe is that some of these organizations are fairly inclusive, say the FAO, for example, or other UN organizations. Countries have one voice there. But at the same time, these are also the organizations that have not proven to be very effective or efficient. So can they actually be reformed while remaining their inclusiveness? Versus the other kind of organizations like the World Bank, for example, largely considered to be more effective, but at the same time very exclusive. So can they actually become more inclusive without losing their effectiveness? And I think there are a lot of open questions to be answered that should be answered against this background of the broader issue of global justice.
Okay. Is there anybody I have left out inadvertently? If not, then Frances, I'd like to warmly thank you for opening this door. I think it was Regina who had that in her slide, an eye-opening book, and really illuminating us and also bringing home to us some of the key messages that Regina picked up in her comments. How do research and development organizations embrace this and embed this within their work, within their targeting, within their design, within their implementation? But not just the research and development agencies, but also civil society groups. I was happy to see, Brian, that you're here with Action Interaction, and so in terms of some of the key roles that the implementing agencies can also play in terms of their actions. But Frances, thank you very much for sharing the work with us. And Regina, I think a very interesting challenge ahead for you of how we are able to mainstream this across IFPRI, just like gender work.